Good morning, everybody. That's better. We're in the middle of a series about where was God when. Today we're considering where was God when a loved one dies. Could you bear with me with my glasses? They're not quite right. I had an example of this myself. 13 years ago, this Thursday, my 25-year-old son died. He was bicycling to work at 7:15 a.m. in London, along the embankment. A lorry driver failed to see him and ran him over. The paramedics and the doctors at the London hospital did all they could, but they couldn't save him. He died a couple of hours later, around 9 o'clock. The first I heard of it was a few hours later, when a policeman knocked on the door and told my husband and I what had happened. It was so horrific. I fainted and was in complete shock. And after we had recovered a little, we were told we had to go and identify his body. So we got in the police car, and as soon as the car started, I felt something rise up within me, and it was the words, "He will live again. He will live again." And I knew at that moment that my son, although dead, would live again. What a joyous, joyous thought. I knew at that moment that Jono was in paradise, in God's heavenly kingdom. And this was the very thing that I wanted for him beyond all others. In fact, the previous day, two friends had been walking along the street past my house, and they just asked me, "Hi Miranda, have you got a prayer request? We don't want to pray for ourselves." So I said, "Could you pray that my son might know the love of God?" And I didn't realize that the very next day I would have that answer. Jono had indeed found the love of God, and he was delighting in his very presence in paradise. I was sure of it, more sure than I could be of anything else. And this helped me it carried me through the next months and years. I experienced that knowledge that God was with him, he was with me, he'd answered my prayer. And Jono was fine, and I would see him again. It isn't always the case when our loved ones die that we feel that we will see them again. But we can be sure of our Christian hope, and that's what I want to talk about today. Although we can be left feeling bereft and lonely, unsure of what happens after death, if we know what God's promises are, that helps. But before we look at the passage from 1 Corinthians, it is helpful to know what the prevailing views on death were at the time Paul was writing. Some in the ancient pagan world thought death was all-powerful and that it couldn't be escaped. Others, like Plato, believed that at death we become a disembodied spirit. The Sadducees also held this view. But many more Jews actually believed in a two-stage process on death. First, we go to paradise, a place of resting in the blissful presence of God, and then we are resurrected, giving us new bodily life. This will take place when God judges and remakes the world. I wonder what we really think happens on death. Jesus' own teaching reinforced the Jewish view of death. He refers to paradise when he tells the brigand who is being crucified next to him, "You will join me this very day in paradise." And he refers to the resurrection as a complete event in the future, when all the righteous will be raised, and things will be different, and there will be no problem about who is married to whom. And in our passage, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul fleshes out what this means for the new Christians. In response to the question, what will our resurrected bodies be like? He says, look at nature. A seed will not grow into a new plant unless it dies first. It's the same for us. When we die, our earthly bodies die. But out comes a new body or a new plant. This new body won't be just like its parent. It will have its own individuality. And Jesus models this for us in his appearances after the resurrection. He appeared in bodily form, looked like a man, and had the physical characteristics of a man. He bore the stigmata and he ate food. He wasn't some vague ghost or spirit. But he wasn't instantly recognizable. The disciples on the road to Emmaus didn't recognize him until he broke bread, even though their hearts were burning within them, as they listened to the scriptures, which he expounded. So after the resurrection, we will have physical transformed bodies. And in verse 44, Paul adds to this by saying that we die as human bodies, but we are raised as spiritual bodies. What he means here is that our future body will be animated by God's Spirit rather than animated by the normal human soul. And this is good news, that we'll be animated by God's Spirit. And in verse 45, Paul adds to this by describing the contrast between Adam and Christ. Adam, the first man, became a living person, while Christ was a life-giving spirit. Our resurrected, transformed spiritual bodies will be imperishable, whilst our human bodies, as we know only too well, are perishable. And these imperishable, immortal bodies won't know any destructive forces, such as we experience today of sickness, injury, decay. We'll no longer be doomed to die. God is sharing his immortality with us as a gift of grace. Verse 43 contains another stark contrast between our human bodies and the spiritual ones we will have. Our bodies are buried in dishonor and brokenness, but they will be raised in power and glory by the Spirit of God. When Paul talks about dishonor and brokenness, he's referring to our propensity for sin and our human frailty. It's the Holy Spirit who will raise us up through his power. He will raise us up to be with God and experience the glory of heaven. Daniel 12 states that we ourselves will have a touch of this glory, because the wise will forever shine as bright as the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness will forever shine like stars. So where does this all leave us? We know there are lots of different views in the world out there. Buddhists hope after death to disappear like a drop in the ocean, while Hindus believe in reincarnation. But our belief is that on death we go to paradise, and then we have a bodily resurrection, a spiritual bodily resurrection, and that we will reign with Christ. So I believe Jono is in paradise now, and he will be resurrected at the right time. And isn't our Christian hope immeasurably more exciting than anything else that could possibly happen on death? Our lives won't be snuffed out, but we'll come back in God's presence, God's loving presence. And it's good to remember this when our loved ones die, that they're going to a better place. We will miss them hugely, but our God is with us. His rod and his staff, they comfort us. We can take heart that we will see them again when we die and find ourselves in paradise. Amen. Father, I pray that you would clarify our thinking about what happens when we die and this wonderful hope that we have for future life with you. Amen.
Miranda, thank you so much for sharing that. We don't underemphasize for a moment how difficult it can be in public, sharing something so painful and so personal. But thank you so much.